A door between dimensions.
Welcome back to the Crash Bandicoot 25th Anniversary Celebration, where I do a bunch of Crash Bandicoot videos to celebrate the series' 25th anniversary. About as straightforward as you can get. So for the last two videos for the celebration, I've been taking a look at specific Crash games in review form, because, well, that's what we do on this channel. But this time around, I want to briefly go back to what I used to do on this channel. And hey, bosses tend to be a fun thing to do for countdowns, so I felt like making a bunch of my really long-time viewers feel old and make bosses the topic of this Crash countdown. To those unaware, this actually isn't the first time I've done this topic. The video doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but I did a top 10 Crash Bandicoot bosses video all the way back in 2012. While the series was still in the midst of its hiatus. Actually, if you want to feel extra old, the amount of time it's been between that original video and now is the same amount of time it was between Mind Over Mutant, the last mainline Crash game before the hiatus, and the Insane trilogy. If you don't feel like doing the math, that's a 9-year gap. Jeez, I felt myself get older just by saying that. But yeah, this topic should be pretty straightforward. Just gonna be counting down my personal favorite bosses in the series. Also, I'm not gonna be doing the one fight per character or one per game rule or anything like that. There can be multiple fights against the same character, and there can be multiple bosses from a single game on this list. Granted, you'll definitely see where my biases lie with that factor, but I did say these were my personal favorites, and I didn't want to force in bosses from games like, I don't know, Crash Bandicoot Purple. And to start things off, we've got ourselves a boss from Crash Bandicoot Purple. Stay with me on this one. As I made quite clear in my Crash GBA Games video, I really don't like this game. A great idea with a baffling execution, it definitely didn't live up to the hype of being the first official Crash and Spyro crossover. And the bosses were one of the many aspects where the game falls flat. Whether it be spending 10 seconds throwing Molotov cocktails at Spyro, or shooting at Tiny using the worst alternate playstyle in the whole series. That said, as I noted in my review, there was one exception. A single boss that was actually pretty good. And it just so happened to be the one in the game's title. Now the fight against Ripto isn't the most complex out there, but then again, as you're going to see over the course of this list, not many Crash bosses are. But yeah, you take on Ripto while riding the Bat, albeit at a way more bearable speed than in the main Bat riding levels, which auto-scroll at a literal snail's crawl. Instead, you find yourself quickly moving around as Ripto summons these whatever they are. You can shoot them, sure, but that's only going to give you more to avoid as they explode into projectiles. And you've already got both those and a continuous burst of fire making its way towards you. Patience is key, as one of those freaky things is a bit less transparent than the others. Don't exactly know how shooting it convinces Ripto to lower his guard, but hey, it does just that, giving you a window to strike, though he's at least smart enough to use his broken shield as a means of attack. But that's not every trick that Ripto has up his sleeve, as when he's got one hit left, his henchman Gulp will fly in and start taking shots at you from above as well, giving you yet another thing to watch out for. Now that I think about it, this fight's kinda got the same energy as one of those airborne boss fights in Cuphead. Not nearly as difficult, granted, but it gives me similar vibes. And hey, I generally liked the airborne boss fights in Cuphead, so it only makes sense that the same would apply here. Unfortunately, the fight doesn't last very long. It can be over in less than a minute, depending on how quickly the non-transparent enemy spawns, but at the very least, it's a pretty fun time while it lasts. Definitely more so than Crash Purple's other bosses. And hey, it's far better than the Cortex fight in Spyro Orange. Poor Spyro fans really got the short end of the already short stick with this crossover. And now we go from a weak boss lineup from one of the weakest Crash games to a weak boss lineup from one of the strongest Crash games. I've made no secret in the past that I absolutely love Crash Team Racing, and yes, that absolutely applies to Nitro Fueled as well. However, both of them do have one common negative. As I said a moment ago, the boss lineup is kinda weak. The boss fights in this game are one-on-one races between you and the boss character, whose way of spicing things up from regular gameplay is just throwing a bunch of items onto the track. Admittedly, not the most interesting way to change it up for a boss fight. Not to say these are bad, just very underwhelming, especially since Ripperoo, Papu Papu, and Komodo Joe just casually throw TNTs and beakers. I almost went with Oxide for this one, but I do admittedly think he's a bit too much of the opposite extreme. He litters the track so extremely with just about everything that it can easily become a hassle to beat him. So instead, I'm going with the fancy Mafia guy. Pinstripe's always been one of my favorites of the non-scientist Crash villains. The classy look, the cheesy accent, the Tommy gun, what's not to love? Unfortunately, while his boss fight in Crash 1 does have a cool concept, but with the need to hide while he's going to town with his Tommy gun, it's a bit too simplistic and easy for my liking. He definitely makes up for the latter one in CTR though. While all the bosses before just turned the track into a sort of minefield, Pinstripe spices things up by instead relying on bowling bombs as his means of attacking. It may not seem like much initially, but you'd be surprised just how much the boss fight dynamic changes when you replace stagnant obstacles with moving projectiles, especially when they move as fast as they do in the original. More so than the other bosses, this one really tests you on your driving skills and being able to quickly maneuver, as well as knowing when's best to use your power-up to slow him down. Fortunately, with the track being Hot Air Skyway, you do have that massive leap of faith over a big old drop, so using that to your advantage can be key. Now yes, one could argue that this fight's even harder than Oxide, and in a way it is, but at the very least, this one feels more like a fair challenge of skill in my opinion. Plus, Pinstripe doesn't jump the starting line like Oxide does, so at least he plays by the rules. I don't know, Pinstripe's just pretty neat, and his characterization and nitro-fueled made me like him even more, especially thanks to Robbie Damon's beautifully cheesy voice performance.
I'm the speed champion here, and I'm gonna save the world. For a sizable fee, of course.
Still don't get why he hid the boss key in his tire, though.
That's why you lost. You put a key in your tire. Moron.
Oh hey, I feel like I was talking about this not too long ago. As I went over my review, Crash Twinsanity is weird, both in its tone and ideas, and in how I feel about it. It's a game I'd say I overall liked, but man, you can really tell it was the result of a troubled development. But I've already done that song and dance in my video on it, so I won't do it again. I will say though, Twinsanity did do a pretty solid job with starting itself off. The opening level, while simple, is fun, giving ample time to grow accustomed to Crash's abilities and controls, while providing a few moments for laughs, all while following quote-unquote Coco. But where the game really shows that it's got some good stuff under its belt is at the end of the level, when quote-unquote Coco is revealed to be Cortex in disguise. I know, right? And you fall right into his trap. It does feel rather odd having Cortex be the first boss of a Crash game, but hey, given the premise of the game, this does make sense. Plus, he does put up a pretty good fight, going to town with his laser gun and even shrinking your ground with bombs after each hit. Soon you're dodging laser fire on the tiniest of platforms, and even if you know what you're doing, it's still a bit nerve-wracking. But just when you think you've got Cortex down, in comes Engine with a giant Mecha Bandicoot! And sure, taking down the Mecha Bandicoot is pretty easy, but it's just the pure chaos of it all, especially for a first boss, that makes it so memorable and fun. Seriously, two of the series' most formidable villains, characters you usually take on at the end of a Crash game, are your first major opposition in Twinsanity. I don't know who at Traveler's Tales pitched this idea, but this one was a really good call. Now granted, it is a little disappointing that all these other Crash villains are present in the cutscene right before the fight, and have zero involvement, not even the spectators, but I'll take what I can get. And as much as it didn't make sense, getting to control the Mecha Bandicoot for the final phase of the final boss was pretty cool as well. So hey, it comes full circle. Shame that Engine's solo mini-boss fight later on in the game was kinda just there though. Like I said, Twinsanity is weird. To help prepare for this video, and to gather footage, I went back and fought a bunch of Crash bosses, and through that, I came to realize that I'm not the biggest fan of Crash 2's bosses. Granted, they're not outright bad, well, aside from Cortex, and there are some neat ideas, but I do think they're kinda weak in execution. However, there is one exception to all this, and I imagine many of you know what I'm talking about. The fight against Engine was kind of the first of its kind when it came to Crash bosses. While bosses in both Crash 1 and 2 prior to this had their own ways of spicing things up, you still stuck to the game's core gameplay mechanics of jumping and spinning. The Engine fight, however, throws spinning out of the question, having to take shots at parts of Engine's battle robot with endless Wumpa Fruit that materializes out of Crash's body as your ammo. Though he does actually throw the Wumpa Fruit in the insane version. Nice attention to detail there. Now yes, shooting at boss weak points became a bit of a norm for the series after this, but again, this was the first of that kind, while also still having you play as Crash on the ground. So even with those later takes, this fight stands out. But it's not like Engine's just gonna let you casually destroy his work. He's got plenty of his own surprises, whether it be lasers, missiles, or more lasers. Plus, since the circle button's now one of the buttons you can use to shoot your artillery, you don't have access to the slide or slide jump for this fight. So there actually is a bit more challenge in having less movement options, especially when dealing with his hand lasers. You're working with the basics here, so you better hope you've mastered your timing of jumps now. Though, given you're near the end of the game at this point, I imagine you already have. Also, the insane version does give you access to the slide and slide jump. But yeah, this fight's pretty solid in an otherwise underwhelming lineup, and it helped set the standard for boss fights against Engine, as you'll be seeing more of down the line. Why yes, that was a bit of foreshadowing. Why do you ask? While Engine is easily my favorite character in the Crash series, let alone my favorite of the scientist characters, it is unfortunate that, for a while, his existence as Cortex's second-in-command did result in the complete neglect of Cortex's former right-hand man, Dr. Nitrous Brio. Yeah, he may not have appeared much in the series, but I did like Brio. From the focus on biochemistry, as opposed to all the other scientists focused on machinery, to him becoming both a foil and an ally in Crash 2. It was cool. And hey, as much as I didn't care for Mind Over Mutant, seeing him come back as a major antagonist was a delight, especially with him being the source of most of the game's funniest moments.
I was in the first game! Look, light bright. I didn't invent this. Bert Meyer did. It's not evil. Why is it in the pile? Paper covers rock. But paper can't stop rocks. It makes no sense!
Fortunately, he has made much more frequent appearances since the revival, being added to Nitro Fuel post-launch and being one of the villains in Crash 4. Now, boss fight-wise though, Brio's a bit of an interesting case. He's only ever had 4 boss fights throughout the series. The one in Crash 1, the one in Twinsanity, where you actually fight Troopy, Brio's just an obstacle, the one in Mind Over Mutant, where you actually fight Crunch, Brio's just running in the background and needs to be hit once to end the fight, and the one in Crash 4. So, only really 2 boss fights. And structurally, these 2 battles are almost exactly the same. Starting with the fight in Crash 1, you take on Brio within Cortex's castle, an already foreboding place atmosphere-wise, which is definitely felt in the feel of the arena. And Brio's no slouch either, making for one of the trickiest fights in the game with his onslaught of explosive potions and slime creatures, which somehow damage him when destroying them, something the Insane version clears up. And sure, the second phase of the fight is quite a bit easier, but the suddenness of his Hulk-like form and him quickly making his way towards you, well, not so quickly in Insane, but still, does add to this already pretty solid battle. Admittedly, the hitboxes on both the slime creatures and on Hulk Brio can be a bit finicky, but even then, it's good stuff. On the flip side though, we have the fight in Crash 4. The arena is quite a bit larger, which does give you more room to avoid attacks. But to compromise, the explosive potions he throws release a shockwave, which especially becomes tricky as the potions become more frequent and thrown quicker. Also, the slime creatures don't have finicky hitboxes, so hey, point for Crash 4. Hulk Brio is quite a bit slower compared to in Crash 1, but with him able to go in any direction and with the shockwaves his pounding fists make, this phase can still be tough. Also, instead of just jumping on his head, you use Akano's Dark Matter Tornado to push him back when he's vulnerable and knock him off the edge, which is pretty satisfying if I do say so myself. So that now begs the question, which of these fights do I go with? The one that did it first, or the variation on it? You know what? I'm gonna cheat for this one. Both fights are similar enough that I think I can warrant having them at the same spot, especially since they're around the same level of quality if you ask me, and it'd feel weird to have them take up 2 separate entries when they're so similar. So yeah, this is the route we're going, and if you're not okay with me cheating like this, well, I don't know what to tell you, sorry. I'm actually not sure what the general consensus on the Cortex fight in the first Crash game is, but speaking personally at least, I've always really enjoyed this one. The setting of the battle alone captivated me as a kid, fighting Cortex atop his massive blimp with his castle on fire in the background. I didn't really see it as such back then, but thinking back, this was one of my first exposures to environmental storytelling in a game. You don't see the fires start while in the levels, nor are you told that they're happening, but just seeing the castle burning down, knowing that your actions as Crash led to this, to Cortex's plans literally going up in flames, it was satisfying in a way I couldn't really describe at that age. But of course, atmosphere alone doesn't guarantee a good boss fight, but it just so happens that Cortex's fight is a fun one. While there's technically less going on in this battle compared to the fight right before against Brio, I feel like this one's a better test of your maneuvering in comparison, as Cortex's variety of laser shots pretty much require you to be moving fairly frequently, whether that be his pink shots that he'll aim directly at you, or his blue shots that'll move in patterns across the ground you stand on, or his green shots that you'll need to spin back at him to do damage. You'll need to be on your toes for most of the fight, especially closer to the end when Cortex starts going crazy with the laser gun. For a boss battle that follows that same sort of simpleness that the other bosses in the game have, this one I find to be pretty effective despite that, which I think makes it a rather memorable final boss for this series at least. Sure, one can argue that the Brio fight is better, and I can see why someone would, but personally at least, I prefer this one. And as a kid, watching Cortex plummet down to the ground below after beating him was incredibly rewarding, marking the first of many memorable face-offs against the Mad Doctor, some of which you may or may not see later on in this video. Okay, yeah, you definitely will. Out of all the non-scientist villains in the Crash series, easily the most popular is Dingodile. From concept alone, he's easily one of the coolest the franchise has ever come up with. fuse a dingo dog with a crocodile, have him use a massive flamethrower, and give him a voice and personality that reminds everyone that the series takes place in Australia. He's definitely one of the most memorable of the mutant characters, and it helps that he gave such a strong fight in his debut appearance. Serving as the second boss in Crash Bandicoot Warped, Dingodile doesn't take long to prove he's not messing around, protecting himself with a multi-layered barrier of crystals while blasting down shots of fire, which increase in frequency and speed after each hit dealt to him. His second attack, however, is arguably his most dangerous, as he blasts at you through his barrier. Now yes, this does make holes in his shield that let you get to him, but you still gotta be careful, because Dingodile's AI isn't afraid to start screwing with you when preparing his shots, sometimes deliberately shooting a bit to the side to catch you if you're running in that direction. This is especially apparent in the Insane version of the fight, where his flamethrower shots are even faster, and his AI likes to resort to trickery far more. And even when you do get to him, you still gotta maneuver around the remaining crystals and get out before his gas tank explodes. It's really clear with this fight just how far the bosses had come by the third game, providing a fight with a fair bit more meat on its bones compared to the previous two games' boss lineups. And this is all before mentioning Dingodile's incredible boss tune, which was already fantastic in the original game, only for the Insane version to step in and, in my opinion at least, make it even better. Regardless of version, it's easily one of the best boss tunes across the whole series, fitting for one of easily the most popular bosses in the series. It's no wonder Dingodile became one of the most common recurring bosses in later games, let alone getting upgraded to a playable character in Crash 4. Also, a little fun fact that some of you probably know already, once you've got the double jump ability, which you get after beating Dingodile, you can actually cheese this fight with it on future attempts by double jumping over each of the barrier layers. They actually brought this back in Insane, and unlike with the exploit in the tiny fight, you won't get cheese thrown at you for doing it. Oh, Wrath of Cortex. What an unfortunate case of executive meddling and strict deadlines resulting in a game that had little chance of being good. Granted, I don't think it's quite as bad as some fans say it is, and I do think it's got its positives here and there, but overall, yeah, it's not too great. And one area that it kind of flops on that I only briefly brought mention to in my review was the boss fights. For one, all the boss fights are against the new mutant villain Crunch, and while yes, each time he's using a different elemental mask, resulting in differing abilities and forms, it's still a shame that the iconic Crash villains who show up in the opening are basically just there for the sake of being there. But even that aside, Wrath of Cortex's boss lineup is pretty weak, with some overall underwhelming if not outright annoying boss fights. There are two exceptions though, Air Crunch, which was actually one of the few airplane sections in the game that was actually good, and the entry that I'm going with, the final battle against Crunch and Cortex. Told you you'd be seeing more Cortex fights on this list, though I guess in this case, Cortex doesn't do a whole lot of fighting, but you do still damage him, so it counts. Instead of relying on one single elemental this time, Crunch quite literally hops from elemental to elemental throughout the fight, prompting one of them to come down and attack you. Starting just with Rocco and his meteors, after each hit another elemental is added in the mix, with Wawa throwing out balls of ice that can incapacitate you, Pyro setting up flames on each of the floor panels, or Lolo activating lasers from the edge of the arena. And with each time an elemental is added, Crunch's patterns for who he chooses to call upon in what order becomes far less predictable, making for what can easily become a pretty intense showdown. Also, shouts for being one of the only times in the entire series that you actually have to put the Wumpa Bazooka to use, shooting at Crunch when he takes a breather. Granted, I'm not entirely sure why Crunch punches Cortex into the arena, but hey, it gives you a chance to spin attack the scientist, so I guess I can't really complain. And all of this is accompanied with one of Andy Blythe and Martin Justra's many fantastic compositions for this game, adding to the tension of fighting what Cortex made to be you, but better, with the power of the elements at his disposal. Wrath of Cortex may not have been great, but at least it was able to end on a high note, that's for sure. First impressions are incredibly crucial when it comes to playing a video game. Not every player is going to have the patience to get over a hurdle at the beginning, so you generally want to start on a strong note, which often includes having a strong first boss. Now the Crash series is kinda hit or miss when it comes to its first bosses, but as shown with Mecha Bandicoot earlier on the list, the times when they get it right can be really effective. And while it wasn't my pick for the best first boss in the series, it does actually have one critical element in common with my pick. They both involve fighting Engine and a giant robot. Like I said, first impressions are crucial, and this is something Crash 4 definitely considers. The first set of levels are pretty good, but following it up with a post-apocalyptic wasteland, a chase sequence combined with a throwback to the Atmosphere, and then having Engine as the first boss? Now that's how you start a Crash game off strong. Using his newest mech, the weapon of mass percussion, I love that name, Engine swapped out his usual arsenal of lasers and missiles in favor of playing reverse Guitar Hero with you. I guess it'd be more drum villain in this case. Using a giant drum set to create his fast-moving projectiles that you'll need to either jump over or slide under. For being a first boss, Engine really doesn't pull any punches, with the projectile pattern getting pretty aggressive with each progressing phase. But with it never feeling cheaply hard, it just makes for an exhilarating fight as you wait for one of his minions to charge in so you can send them flying into Engine speakers. And hey, it even incorporates some of that fancy reality phasing you've been learning how to use throughout the past 3 levels, used as a means to get up to Engine when his robot's down to damage it. I do really like that the quantum mask powers are included in the boss fights as a whole, this one included. Though what boss fight based around music would be complete without some solid music to go with it? Well, it just so happens that Engine's got himself a rockin' boss theme, complete with some hints of leitmotif from his previous series boss tracks. It's one of my personal favorites in the game, to put it simply. But yeah, all in all, as weird as it is to have Engine as a first boss, given how often he tended to be closer to the end in previous games, barring Twinsanity, he definitely does a great job at helping with Crash 4's first impressions. And given this was the first original mainline Crash game in over a decade, it's a good thing that the game went as strong as it did from the get-go. A funny trend I've come to realize for the Crash series and its bosses is that, in many of the games, the penultimate boss tends to be one of, if not the best, of its lineup. Think about it. Prio's one of Crash 1's best, Pinstripe's one of CTR's best, Ripto's the only good fight in Crash Purple. It's not always the case, of course, but it does tend to happen frequently. And wouldn't you know it, here's another example of that. I've already gone a bit into this fight in my Crash GBA games video, but the battle against Entrance in Crash Bandicoot, well, Entranced, is easily the best boss not just in its own game, but across all the Crash GBA titles. This one goes the multi-phase route, with the first phase playing out in a way similar to that of K. Rool from Donkey Kong Country. Actually, now that I think about it, these are practically the exact same structurally. Entrance hops around a set number of times before using an attack that leaves him open for damage, in this case, shooting his claw hand at you. Though much like its presumed inspiration, you do gotta be careful just off the sheer size of your opponent, with Entrance being notably larger and thus capable of easily crushing you. And if this is all the fight had going for it, it probably wouldn't be this high. However, Entrance does have a second trick up his sleeve, as he takes to the sky once his health is down and kicks off a second phase. Now in the Copter Pack, you've got to bounce Entrance around like a pinball with your spin attacks, until you can get him under Fake Crash's lava trap for damage. But this egg ain't gonna just let you boil him that easily, and thus will release an absolute onslaught of projectiles, with absolutely no set pattern to which he does and when, so you really need to be cautious at all times. Entrance's projectiles can get genuinely aggressive, and with your slower movement, this win ain't gonna come easy. And yes, if you die, you end up going back to phase 1, but at least unlike with the Entropy fight afterwards, the first phase is not only fun, but it's also short, so getting back to the second phase won't take long. It's no wonder the game's called Entranced rather than Entroopied. This joke was way funnier in my head, I apologize. If I had to pick a single Crash game to declare as the Crash game with the best overall boss lineup, I would 100% go with Crash Bandicoot Warped. And not even just because it's my favorite of the platformer titles. It's the only title in the whole series I can think of where every single boss fight is, at the absolute least, good. But even then, most of the bosses in the game go beyond just good. I already went over Dingodile as an example, but the next entry is going to be another example of that. And sure enough, it's none other than its take on a final battle against Cortex. Right from the get-go, this fight's already got a lot more going for it than the last time you took on Cortex. While in Crash 2 you simply, and very pathetically, pursue him through an asteroid field while he never attacks you, this time around you're going head-to-head within the Time Twister machine, which thanks to Entropy being out of commission is now at risk of collapsing in on itself. And on top of that, you two aren't the only ones fighting this time. While Cortex is shooting blasts and throwing mines at you, Aku Aku and Uka Uka are having their own feud on the same battlefield as you, changing up their methods of attacking each other in each chunk of the fight. This is a great way of making the fight extra tricky, requiring you to keep an eye out for the masks at all times as their attacks can and will kill you. Fortunately though, I wouldn't say that hinders the fight at all, as it's not needlessly hard, nor is it difficult to get back to where you were if you die. It's also incredibly satisfying when you're able to knock Cortex off his hoverboard and bounce him around with your spin attack. The punch sound effect in particular makes this feel great. And that's before mentioning what's arguably the most iconic boss theme Cortex has ever had in this series, which, like Dingodale's, got even better with the Insane version. Now admittedly, I do wish they changed up the fight a bit for when you have to repartake in it for the 100% ending, but that's really just a nitpick. This fight's super solid as is, so I don't mind going through it again to get the true ending, where Cortex gets turned into a baby with facial hair. As one does. Oh, you thought I was done with Warped, eh? Yeah, not quite yet. Cortex may make for a great final boss, but he's not the best that the game has to offer boss-wise. With that said, how's about we go back to talking about the best scientist villain in the series, and the fantastic tricks he had up his sleeve in Crash 3. Marking the first and only time in the series that you exclusively play as Coco for a boss fight, the showdown with Engine's latest mech, now certified Wumpa Fruit proof, is easily one of Warp's most memorable moments. Set on the moon, you go to town using a spacecraft of your own as you shoot away at Engine's mechanical marvel, which itself is armed with shoulder missiles and arm-mounted Gatling guns. You may be able to take more hits than the usual fight thanks to your fancy health bar, but Engine's artillery can do some considerable damage, especially with that core intact. So being smart about what you attack and when is important. But just when you think it's over, surprise! Engine's got more up his sleeves. Now with some extra firepower provided by Purah, the fight's now further up in space as Engine takes shots at you with even more missiles, laser ball cannons, and this weird golden bomb thing. If not prepared, this can definitely come off as overwhelming, but man, when you know what you're doing, this phase especially is great amounts of fun. The general frantic nature of it all is exhilarating, and while there's no special reward for doing so, it's especially fun to try and do a no damage run on this fight, which yes, I have actually done on more than one occasion.
Can I do it? Can I do it? Yeah! Woo! I feel so proud of myself.
Now admittedly, I do think the Insane version of the fight does lose a bit of that exhilaration, as Engine's attacks are slower and there's a generally less frantic energy to the movement, but that said, both versions of the fight are still fun, and easily the best Engine fight the series has provided up to this point. Well done, you rocket-headed lunatic. I'm not sure how many of you who saw my original take on this topic from 2012 remember this, but in that original video, I specifically noted how I hadn't played Twinsanity or Crash the Titans at the time, and thus wasn't including any bosses from either game. Well, am I certainly glad that that's since changed, because now that means I get the pleasure of talking about fighting Dingodile in Twinsanity. Don't expect anything from Titans though on that note, just as a heads up. But yeah, anyone who watched my Twinsanity review knew this one was coming, as I did note in that video that Dingodile's boss fight was one of the best in the whole series, and yep, I still stand by that. It already helps that this battle's following up one of Twinsanity's best levels, Boiler Room Doom, but then you find yourself face to face with the Dingo-Crocodile hybrid as the not didgeridoos greet your ears. Still love how above and beyond Sparrowmouth went with this game's soundtrack, and this boss theme's no exception. And hey, it just so happens to go with an equally great boss fight. Swapping out the crystal barrier with a fire barrier, Dingodile doesn't hesitate in trying to roast ya, starting with simple fireball shots, but soon breaking out stuff like streams of fire for you to either jump over or slide under, and even a wall of fire for you to book it from. But as the fight goes on, fittingly like how he was in Warped, Dingodile's behavior starts getting trickier to predict, as he'll sometimes juke you out with the streams of fire's direction, or even its positioning, requiring you to swap methods on the fly. It may not be the hardest fight once you know what you're doing, but it's still incredibly fun and memorable. And also surprisingly atmospheric with the intense a cappella music and the heat-induced arena. Easily the best fight in this very bizarre part of the Bandicoot's repertoire. Alright, now that we've had our brief break from it, let's get back to talking about Crash Bandicoot Warped. Like I said earlier, Warped has easily the best boss lineup in the whole series, and I was more than happy to make that known with my choices on this list. Yeah, there's a hint of personal bias in that decision, but hey, these are my favorites, so I'm just being honest with you all. And while yes, Engine's fight easily has the most spectacle and the most going on gameplay-wise out of all the game's bosses. Oh, who am I kidding? You all know where this is going.
Now you're on my time, you little skunk! Give me the crystals!
Yep, it's none other than the fight that was my original number 1 way back in the day. As an avid lover of time-themed anything in media, Dr. Nefarious Troopy definitely stands up there as one of my favorites of Crash's Rogues Gallery. Heck, even as a kid first playing Warped, his silent introduction in the game's opening always stuck out to me. From him visibly lingering in the shadows while Uka Uka chewed out Cortex, before finally emerging and revealing his blue-skinned Jafar-ness. And that reveal wasn't just for show. He was the creator of the Time Twister, your very means of accessing the game's various levels. So he was just as big a deal as Cortex or Uka Uka, making the eventual fight against him that extra special. And man, what a fight it is! Now I'll admit that part of my love for this battle is the nostalgia factor, as battle-wise it is relatively simple. But again, these are my favorites, so I'm just being honest with you all. Using that tuning fork of his, Entropy will take shots at you both with fast-moving projectiles and with these energy waves that'll cross the platform you stand on. And in each chunk, these become more frequent and with switched up patterns. Honestly, after doing the same type of fight but on a 2D plane and Entranced, I've come to really appreciate having the 3D space this one has, both for avoiding his attacks and for allowing more variety. Also, while it may not change much to the fight itself, Entropy switching up the surrounding setting in each chunk was a nice visual touch to the battle. Now that said, the Insane version of his fight is kind of interesting. On one hand, like with the engine fight, some of the oomph from the battle is a bit lost in this version, particularly with the start. But on the other hand, his attacks are actually even faster than before, making the fight more of a challenge, which hey, I can appreciate. Whichever version you go with though, I've still got a soft spot for this boss, and to this day, it remains the one and only Entropy boss fight that's actually good. Shame too, a villain this cool definitely deserves better. So I want to start this segment off with a little story time. I was very invested into Crash as a kid. I know, big surprise. And because of that, I often liked to imagine more adventures with a crazy cast of characters. So much so that I'd draw mock-ups for hypothetical Crash game ideas, or even write Crash fanfiction. Yes, that was a phase I went through at one point in my life. The point is, over the years, I've thought of tons and tons of scenarios for these characters I was invested in. And one that always stuck out to me was as such. Cortex, using some of Entropy's time travel tech, would go back in time, to before the events of Crash 1, and try to stop his past self from ever creating Crash. Sure, other franchises would do stories like this as well, but I liked to think about how such a scenario would play out in Cortex's case, especially since time travel technology was already a thing in the series. So you can imagine my absolute shock and giddiness when Crash Bandicoot 4 did this exact scenario. Now yes, I will admit, with the way everything was being set up story-wise, having Entropy and Femtropy serve as the original main antagonists and final bosses probably would have made more sense, and I can understand why someone would be disappointed in Cortex snatching up those roles for himself at the end of the game. That said, words cannot describe how excited I was to see Cortex actually go through with this plan I had imagined all those years ago, albeit using Kapunawa instead of Entropy tech. And man, did they go all out with that final world, creating a set of levels very reminiscent of the Cortex Island levels from the original game, while still having their own original flair. Granted, I do think it would have been cool if the past Cortex had his insane design or was voiced by Clancy Brown or something, as a neat little Easter egg, but even then, I was having an absolute ball with this finale. And that was before I got to Cortex himself. For as much as certain aspects of Crash 4 got on my nerve as I was playing through it, words cannot describe just how joyful I was taking on Cortex at the end of the game. The whole scenario of fighting Cortex in the past was already exciting as is, but then right when the fight starts, he takes the Quantum Masks. From there, you probably have the coolest way they could have tested you with these powers for a final battle. You already put them all to use while fighting the Troopies, so why not this time, let the boss use them against you? From reality shifting the ground, to flipping you upside down, to toggling the flow of time as platforms rise and fall and lasers go off, this fight tests you in such a creative way for a Crash boss. And even beyond that, the fight continues to be a blast. Dodging lasers, stomping on electrical wave-spawning shoot-o-matics, spinning lab assistants back at Cortex for damage. There's a lot going on, but never does it feel like too much, helped by deaths respawning you at the most current phase rather than the very start. And then there's the matter of the music. True, it doesn't include Cortex's leitmotif that's present in his boss themes for the original trilogy, or his boss theme for the first fight against him in Crash 4, but mixing together his boss theme from Warped with instrumentation and melodies of the main Crash 1 theme, it makes for some beautiful music that fits this incredible battle. Don't get me wrong, Crash 4's definitely got its flaws, that's difficult to deny. But even with that in mind, the sheer amount of love and care that went into this game really shows, and at certain points helps bring the game up beyond its shortcomings. And this final battle is definitely one of those points. It's a fun challenge that creatively tests you with the game's newest central mechanic, it's got some great atmosphere and music, and speaking personally, it helped in delivering on a concept that I've wanted to see the series try for an incredibly long time. So with all that in mind, there's absolutely no doubt that this boss fight's easily my favorite in the entire Crash Bandicoot franchise. And that marks another video for the 25th anniversary celebration. I've been wanting to redo this topic for quite some time, even before coming up with the idea of doing this series of videos, but I'm really glad that I waited until after Crash 4 was a thing. But before we go, it's time for another personal recommendation. This time, I'm gonna go with a fellow reviewer and fellow Crash Bandicoot fan, StephanieSparda. As I noted just a few seconds ago, StephanieSparda largely does game reviews. Good, bad, old, new, AAA, indie, shovelware, Life of Black Tiger. Steph's topics for reviews are certainly varied. That said, they do tend to be consistently informative, and consistently entertaining. If you'd like a sample of what her stuff is like,
their titles include, of course, Life of Black Tiger, Life of Deer, Life of Wolf 2014, Life of Wolf Reboot, X-Wolf, and Wolf Online. I feel like these guys must really like wolves. Battlefront 2 is kinda weird territory for me because I don't typically get all that into online multiplayer games, for one reason. I'm very bad at them. Thor's hammer sounds like a rubber kickball smacking you in the face, and it gives me flashbacks to grade school. I'd tell you how the main story ends, but the game crashed on me at the final boss. I took that as the universe telling me that it's time to stop playing. Even my PS4 has had enough.
But yeah, that's the kind of stuff Steph tends to offer. So if that's up your alley, give her videos a look. With that all said and done, this has been Black Mage Benjamin, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.